small Hanebrink text, Antisemitism and Racism, investigate the intricate entanglement of racism and antisemitism in fascist and far-right ideologies, tracing their evolution across historical moments and examining their continued relevance today. He situates his argument within the framework of Tim Mason's historiographical intervention in 1991, What Happened to Fascism?, in which Mason showed his concern on the shift in scholarly focus from comparative study of fascism to the Holocaust origin and implementation. I will address this concern now. Hanebrink used this seminal work as a springboard to explore how anti-Semitism and racism, while overlapping, maintain fluid and context-dependent relationship that shape both historical and contemporary far-right politics. Mason, in 1991, lamented the decline of comparative study of fascism in favor of Holocaust-centric scholarship, arguing that this shift narrowed the field's moral and analytical focus. That is to say, it's not that he was thinking that there was not a difference. On the contrary, that focusing enormously on the Holocaust was giving to fascism a more tolerable place, a situation that you could live with it politically. Mason acknowledged the challenge posed by Nazis' anti-Semitism, which he described as so uniquely obsessive and destructive that it threatened to undermine generic concept of fascism. In the quarrel with Renzo De Felice, for example, on his book on the interview on fascism, he described that this discussion on fascism brought ahead by one of the main leading figures of the field of fascism, causing a depoliticization of the historical consciousness. Special trials courts were bad, but the drainage of the Pontina was good. Paul builds on this insight, suggesting that the Holocaust singularity does not preclude comparative analysis, or at least so I read you, but rather demands, a more nuanced approach that accounts for both particularities and intersection. He emphasized, Hanebrink, the need to balance this with an acknowledgement of the Holocaust as a civilization brook. He explores how Nazi anti-Semitism both reflected and exceeded the racial ideological frameworks of other fascist regimes, challenging scholars to grapple with its dual status as both a part of and a departure from the broader phenomenon on fascism. The text of Paul is a sophisticated exploration of the complex interplay between racism and anti-Semitism. However, there are some specifications that we could work with. And for example, sorry, I'm not used to read from the computer, so I'm a bit. So he focused primarily on Europe and the Atlantic. His discussion of racism and anti-Semitism, I believe, would gain richness from a more global perspective. For example, expanding how colonial racial ideologies, and I'm thinking about the policy of Italy, for example, in Oriental Africa, intersected with European anti-Semitism, and this could illuminate transnational dimension of these discourses. And the gender dimension that you should be also brought more to the specificity. And now some few remarks on racism and anti-Semitism. I'm writing on Julius Evola anti-Semitism, working on its racism, brought to me a kind of suggestion of what are the differences between the two phenomena. They are certainly rooted, and they both pursue a model of knowledge that is rooted in the concept of race. And this concept is never neutral or objective scientific hypothesis. Instead, it is a vision in which human beings are inherently unequal and divided into inferior and superior groups. Paul Hanebrink as well shown not that the category of racism and anti-Semitism, as you all know, there was a very huge debate on the definition of anti-Semitism. I'm against definitions in general, because definition, they always leave out something. And so there is never a broader definition of what it could be described anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is not an analytical category. And the paper of Paul show, he brought 3 historical cases in which there is a use of race differently and use of concepts differently, but they happened. If they in Hungary, if in Italy with the racist laws, and if we are talking about the racial state of Germany, you have to have an event. It's not enough to state theoretically. It must have an implementation. And here I would like to address the development, but I will stay only on the 19th century. The 19th century witnessed a troubling regression with the resurgence of anti-Jewish prejudice converging with new anthropological and biological racism. The ambiguities of physical anthropology degenerated into grotesque distortion under the influence of Romantic thought. Instead of envisioning humanity's future, Romanticism turned towards an idealized past, relying on organicist metaphors and a language that it could be defined vegetative, such as development, growth, roots. This perspective elevated instinct over reason, tradition over innovation, and sought to preserve and enhance difference rather than dissolve them within the progress of human civilization. This fixation on origins culminated in what Leon Polyakov termed the Aryan myth, a foundational narrative for the civilization and peoples of Europe. European nationhood, and I was trying to say this morning when I asked what is the difference, European nationhood and not nationalism failed to reinterpret its past in multi-ethnic and multi-religious terms. Instead, biology and race, framed as the scientific constructs, supplanted religion as the defining boundaries of the political communities. And we go back to Spain, traces its roots to the Goths. France oscillated between the myths of the Gauls and the Franks. Germany identified with its Germanic ancestry. England embraced Celtic origin. Russians turned to Slavic and Euro-Asian roots. Italy, aligned with the myth of Aeneas, tying itself to Latin ancestry and ancient Rome. The 20th century intensified the quest for racial identity, lending it an aura of scientific rigor. Increasingly reliant on biology, this focus turned to the physical traits that ostensibly characterize and differentiate human groups. The concept of race acquired legitimacy, blending historical ideology with scientific analysis. This synthesis proved perilous, giving rise not only to the identification of racial traits, but also to a qualitative hierarchy, a taxonomy that ranked races. The degeneration of racial science into racism emerged within this context. And here I pass to the last things that I wanted to stress. And yet, what is the difference? Because there is a difference. Racism and anti-Semitism are consequential and applied aspects of the theory of race. They derive their principle from the same cluster, but do not entirely overlap with each other. And this raises another question. Racism and anti-Semitism then, despite their significant overlap, genuinely diverge in their core principle. The question, in my eyes, at least I'm working with it, involves distinguishing what could be called inegalitarian racism, a more generic form of racism, from differentialist or morphological racism, that is anti-Semitism. The difference is that Evola speaks about that, but not only Evola. There is always there this kind of, there is this excess in anti-Semitism. Now, the differential racism is a racism in which each race and each culture should be taken on their own. Now, there is also a hierarchy within this differentialist, I would say, methodology, yes, so to speak. Talking about integral racism of Evola, for example, it was rooted in an esoteric spiritual nature, proposing a racial hierarchy with the Aryan European people at the top. Within this group, the Nordic type, in the differential racism, is identified as the superior forms, based not solely on biological criteria, but on spiritual grounds. And here I go again to the Renzo De Felice, because in his book on the history of the Italian Jews, he describes Evola, a form of racism, as a cultural racism, an ideological construct without immediate practical consequences. That is problematic because it's far to be true. Let's say is the fascism, or what it was called by Traverso post-fascism or neo-fascism in Italy, for example, is very much sticking to this definition of Evola. So, but even on this presumed classification of biologies versus culture, we must remember that even Nazi racism was not entirely biological, as fascist racism was not only and entirely cultural. There is this kind of passing between. What is the first category of inegalitarian racism? Is colonial racism, whose aim is the hierarchization of races, ethnicity, castes, and social classes within a specific national context or territory. Its goal is to subordinate inferior races to the dominators. In this form of racism, I maintain, the dominators establish the racial hierarchy while placing themselves outside it. They racialize others, but not themselves. In contrast, anti-Semitism, as a form of differentialist racism, operates on different parameters. Its proponents must racialize themselves, self-identifying as a superior race, such as the Aryans, which must then be proven. The racist law, and now I will consider it, the racist legislation in Europe targeting the Jews, such in Germany, in Italy, also in France, and if we think about the German Aryanism of Gunther and Rosenberg, as well as the Aryan Roman Latin ideology of Aeolian origin, require proofs of the claims to be Aryan. Within this frame, the racist laws were simultaneously prescriptive and descriptive. That is to say, they were not only tools for exclusion, identifying and classifying those outside the Gemeinschaft, but also a tool for inclusion, the members of the community. Those categorized as non-Aryans, were deemed not to be assimilable, and thus had to be expelled, exterminated from the body of the nation. The survival of the nation depended on its ability to select and purify according to ethno-cultural criteria. Thank you.